I'd like to welcome everyone on the Seven Network to this very special presentation with Bob Dotson. There are very few people in this world that I look up to, certainly none at our opposition Channel 9, but Bob Dotson is one of the giants of this industry and we're very, very lucky to have him here. Bob is a guy who knows what the basics of television are. He knows the power of storytelling, he knows the power of writing. He's been with the NBC network in America. He's on the Today Show. Bob Dotson's American Story is a legend on that program. And he's won 5 Edward R. Murrow Awards for writing. He's won 4 Emmys and about 100 other prizes as well. This guy is one of the giants of the industry and we are very lucky to have him here to give us his insights into this business that we all love. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Peter. He's my brother by another mother. This is going to be very informal, so if you have a question you want to ask, why, give a call, give a shout out, and we'll try to answer it. I am essentially a correspondent like the rest of you, but after having been around since the Earth was cooling, I've been watching to see what works. And one of the things I try to do is to find some efficiencies during the day so that we can do what we really set out to do, which is to tell a good story. For the last 10 years, you know, we've been so caught up with putting up the circus tent that we sometimes give very little time to what we're going to do inside the circus tent, which is tell a story. So here are a couple of tips. No matter how complicated a story you have to do, some of the best follow the same curve. They begin with, hey, get their attention. Hey. And then almost always overlooked is the second part, you. This story is about you. So almost immediately, like in a good mystery novel, there's somebody dead on the first page, hey. But equally important is, I don't care if it's a train wreck in Kalgoorlie, this is the reason why in Brisbane you would care about it. This is a story about you. The third part about that line is see. Hey, you, see. See is the 2 or 3 points that I've been able to find as I did this story that maybe no one else had, which is increasingly difficult because, of course, we're not going to be the first people to tell the story. So maybe the see part of your story is how you interpret the story, what you found out using the available evidence that puts some perspective, some context. Hey, you, see. That's the easiest part. And the final part is so. So why should you, as the viewer or the reader, care? Hey, you, see, so. No matter how complicated the story might be, no matter how many people on location try to spin the story for you, when you sit down to write your story, you say, well, where am I on this? Am I at the hey, the you, the see, or the so? And all good stories begin with asking good questions. What we've been faced with in the last 4 or 5 years are people who are professional storytellers or professional soundbite givers, like the mayor and the baseball player and that sort of thing. But what makes your story stand out differently than others is what you can bring out from ordinary people who are not geared to being on television. So there's several ways to do that. And one of the things I found is people always answer your question in threes. They give you the answer they think you've asked for, and then they explain it. And if you wait just a beat, which is something we on television very seldom do, we jump in with the next question. But if you wait just a beat, they get a little concerned that they haven't explained it well enough, and they say, well, dummy, that's why I killed my wife. And then you got a soundbite. So it's the rule of threes. And if you wait for that third part, you're going to get better soundbites. The second way of approaching that is the non-question question. What occurs is that most people are very nervous, as you know, when you wander in. And so if I say, hey, I'm Bob Dotson with the Today Show, the ordinary person just kind of clams up. Instead, I might say, boy, those are beautiful chrysanthemums, and they're working out in their backyard, and they're cutting on flowers. And this is a tip that I got from an old-time NBC cameraman, because way back when I was a young reporter, we were out trying to get a soundbite from the Shah of Iran's son, who was being trained at an Air Force base in West Texas. His dad was sick. We staked him out for days. Nobody ever saw him. So we all went to lunch one day, and everyone left their photojournalists standing there to see, just in case he should show up. We came back from McDonald's, and Scotty Berner, the cameraman, said, well, I got the soundbite from the Shaw of Iran's kid. I fed it to New York, and I did a little crosstalk, with the anchor. Well, that last part he was lying, but the rest of it he'd already done. And this is how he did it. He saw this fellow walking down the street who looked like he didn't grow up in West Texas. So he assumed that he might be the Shah of Iran's son, but he didn't know. Had his camera on his shoulder, he wanders up. The kid is kind of looking at the flowers. So Scotty says, those are beautiful chrysanthemums, aren't they? And the son said, yup, they're very, very pretty. And Scotty said, my dad owned a flower shop, which was true. And the boy said, well, my dad liked flowers too. And Scotty said, my father passed away last year, which was also true. And the boy said, soundbite, 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 soundbite. He still wasn't sure if he was the Shah of Iran's son, but there were a couple of security guards behind a hedge near the house that we'd been staking out, and they kind of peeked up and they went, oh, my dear, 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 and they started running down the driveway. And so Scotty didn't turn around and start arguing his First Amendment journalism freedoms with two guys carrying their Second Amendment sidearms. He just started shooting cutaways, pictures that finished out the story. Now, at no time did he say that he was not a journalist. It's pretty obvious. He's got the NBC logo on the side of his camera. He wasn't doing anything untoward, but what he was doing was he was directing the conversation after putting the person at ease over to what you wanted to get. So I call that the non-question question. And many times if I approach somebody who is nervous, I start talking about something that seems to be central to their lives without ever asking a direct question. So the rule of threes and the non-question question, and also fill the silence. People are always, they're always a little tense when you say nothing. If you watch a good cop show, the detectives always say the person who speaks in the interview room first loses, because they try to fill with information you haven't asked for yet. Well, I use that same technique with ordinary people. So what happens is you get all kinds of great sound bites, most of which you can't use because you don't have enough time. But when you go back to put your story together, you say, all right, what emotion is in this story? And it's all from the information that you've received. And so the best sound bite, of course, goes in your story. But the second sound bite, you can paraphrase and make it your opening line. It's already got an emotional element because you found it twice. Once when you did it, and once when you went back looking for it. And secondly, it's right on schedule, and you don't have to sit there and angst over how to write your opening line. So when I start to write a story, I always write the middle first, the C. These are the 3 or 4 things that I think are kind of interesting. It's the easiest to write, and at the time you're doing this, you're also being able to bring people to the story with the information you have. And as you're going through the individual pieces of information, you say, look, that'll make the audience happy, that'll make them mad, that'll make them frustrated. You can find the central emotion. And all day long, whenever I'm assigned a story, I play a little game. I say, if I have to quit right now, and I have to tell this story right now, what's the point of the story? What's the closing line? How do I do this? And it may change all day long, and it would, of course, in a breaking news situation, but at least you've got a place to go. And as anybody in the theater will tell you, if you know when you're going to get off the stage, you know how to get there. Where we really get in trouble and we lose a lot of time during the day in doing our stories is that we don't know where we're going. So I constantly say, if I had to leave right now, where would I go? For instance, I covered a tornado one time, and there was a fellow who was wandering around looking for something, and it was really kind of a grade C tornado story. It was like 2 days old, no injuries, a couple of mobile homes blown over. But I had to do it. It was the noon news. So I followed this guy around, and the cameraman I was with followed this man around. The rest of the reporters were all going with the governor, who had finally shown up and was going to say, you know what the soundbite is, I'm going to ask for some federal assistance for this town. But I figured I could cover that in copy. So I forgot about the governor, and I kept following this man to see what he was looking for. And finally, he reached down into a pile of goo, rubble, and found a little piece of pink, and he brought it up right next to his his face, because he was very comfortable with us, because we'd been around him off and on. And he said, "Well, it got my teeth, but it didn't get me." That was my close. I knew it was my close. So all I had to then do is to structure the story to get to that point. And all good stories haven't changed the way you put it together since some guy went down in a valley and killed a mastodon and then came back and painted the picture on the cave and said, "Boy, you should have seen the size of this thing." So it's the same way with this. I knew I was going to go to that punchline, so I used the man as foreshadowing. You know, you have a scene setter, you put that out. I'm in Enid, Oklahoma. Look at this. Here's some mobile homes blown over. And then here's this guy, and he's wandering around, and you mention who he is, but what's he looking for? You don't say it quite that rough, but basically you're setting up a little mystery, a little foreshadowing, and then you go on and you tell the other parts of the story you have to tell. The governor's there, this happened, that happened, whatever. And then you work your way back around to what he finds. And the whole piece ran maybe 55 seconds, and maybe took 20 minutes to shoot. But I got more mail from that story than I'd gotten from anything I'd done in 5 years, because it was rooted in a strong central character who looked a lot like the people watching TV, and people, as we know from reality shows, love to see themselves. So why not find the people who will sell your story, ordinary people who are doing something with great passion or humor or anger or whatever, and showcase it so that you can do that. Let me give you a case in point. There's a fellow that I had passed going to work for maybe a year and a half, and I was always intrigued by the fact that he was wearing a $2,000 suit, and he was selling potato peelers. Now, how could you get a $2,000 suit if you're selling $5 potato peelers at Union Square in New York City? Take a look at this piece.
Today's American Story with Bob Dotson comes from one of this country's best-known addresses, home to some of the wealthiest people on earth, and a man who has made a fortune selling on street corners.
In the garden of life, big things can grow from small beginnings,
And you make 5 cuts in a carrot. You can all do that.
provided you use enough fertilizer.
Kids, come up a yard. You'll see better. Come on. Don't worry. I won't ask you for money.
Joe Odyssey could talk a starving dog off a meat truck.
Now come up round the front. I'll show you how this works.
The man in the $1,000 suit sells $5 potato peelers.
And you turn the whole potato into great French fries.
Very cool.
Lots of them.
There you go.
You won't believe his warehouse.
So where do you keep the potato peelers?
Right in here.
Boxes and boxes in his Park Avenue apartment.
Really?
Yep, Park Avenue.
Never underestimate a small amount of money.
Gathered by hand, 6 days a week, for 60 years.
Now why would you buy 4 peelers if they last a lifetime? Because you've got 4 friends, that's why.
Joe's business makes him something of a mystery man in this posh neighborhood.
Some people suspected that he might be Sean Connery.
Just pull the handle. Just try it.
He's got an English accent, but he's probably from Mobile, Alabama. Who knows?
The accent is as real as the bombs in his boyhood backyard. Joe grew up in Great Britain during World War II, learning from pitchmen who set up in the rubble.
Joe Squinters, Black Dougie, Heckle and Peckle. They were brilliant.
And so, it turned out, is Joe.
Big crowd.
What's the most unusual thing you've sold?
Unusual. Christmas trees in February. I'm not kidding.
Joe taught his daughter Ruth how to hawk children's books on the street, so she could put herself through Columbia University.
What's the key to your dad's success?
Tenacity and patience.
I think that's the secret of happiness, not doing what you like, but liking what you do.
Joe lives the kind of life most of us only see in the movies, but he wanted to share it with someone. So he took out an ad looking for a wife, his 4th. He received 600 proposals, picked 3 possibles. The next evening, he met the woman he would marry. She had not seen the ad.
That's the happiest time of my life. My late wife, Estelle.
She died of breast cancer last November. Now he works for the other women in his life, his granddaughters.
Me and my friend went to a river and we caught minnows.
Minnows. I want the kids to go to the best colleges that it's possible to go to, and I want to pay for it.
That's why Joe is up before dawn every day. At 74, still pushing potato peelers down Park Avenue.
Do you ever take a vacation?
Life is a vacation. Every day is a vacation.
To be savored. For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story on Park Avenue.
Well, you see, when you go out to do a story like that, you always hope that you can find the second layer. And this is true if you're doing a Twitter rather, or if you're doing a minute 10 or a documentary. I happen to work in a longer format because my background is documentary from way back. So I use a lot of those same techniques. But it doesn't really change. I mean, even if you're working at Twitter length or you're just writing a headline, think of it as poetry. Or think of it as a country western lyric, like "Honey, the gutterina step up from you," instead of, "Well, I went to the mall and bought a green sweater," which is what most people do when they get on the new social media. But for all of us, you see, we'd kind of like to keep getting that paycheck on Friday. And if we want to do that, we have to keep a step ahead of the amateurs who are going to scoop us all the time in terms of spot news, but maybe they can't tell a story like we tell it. And part of it is to use those techniques like rule of threes, filling the silence, and the non-question question, because that's how I got past his original story, which is, well, you know, I sell these potato peelers and I've been pretty lucky. But if you sit there long enough, he says, well, you know, once upon a time I was in England, and then he tells you the rest of the story. And you start to connect it. And each story is like an onion. You try to put in as many layers as possible. And we're the last of the really broad major media. And you don't need a PhD to turn on TV or radio or a podcast. It's all there. So you have to reach people who have no interest in your story. And you have to make them be interested. I always start every story, and this is so different than most journalists, but I start every story assuming that nobody cares about anything I'm going to tell them. And then I start finding the universal buttons that help to hook the people into the story. For instance, everybody's got a father. Everybody's got a mother. Everybody hopes that their house is going to be safe. Everybody likes to laugh. So, you know, the best comedians can make a 4-year-old laugh and an 80-year-old laugh, and it's because of the craft. I used to worry because when I was a young reporter, I didn't think I was as good as some of the people who were all my heroes. And then I started to realize that, yeah, talent helps, but you can always learn. If you're curious, use your imagination, you can learn the craft. For instance, I went out to do a market basket story, and it was like the price of meat. And there was an old assignment editor at our affiliate in Fort Worth, and he saw me about ready to go out with my crew. And he said, you know, how are you going to do this? And I said, well, I think I'm going to get a guy in a striped suit to tell us about the market and how that works. And some people back in New York have got some great graphics. And he says, no, you got it all wrong. And I said, oh, really? I'm a network tool, and you're here. And he says, no. He says, why don't you go down to the butcher shop here and ask them to bring out a hunk of meat. Now, not steak like you network boys eat, but stew meat like the rest of us eat. Just put it out on the butcher table and say, okay, this is how much meat you could buy for $5 5 years ago. And then ask the butcher how much meat you could get for $5 today. And he says, by the time he whacks that away to an hors d'oeuvre, he says, I tell you, Grandma is going to know what you're talking about. So I did. It was like a 45-second story on nightly news. And again, it just went over the top in terms of how people reacted to it, because it was rooted in this guy's imagination and in ordinary people. The way we're going to separate ourselves from the folks who are amateurs is to have really good content delivered well. There's only two ways to tell a story. One is to have information that nobody else has, and that's getting more and more difficult. And the other way is to tell it in such a fashion no one cares that they didn't have, that they've heard the information before. They just like the way you tell it. And if you can establish that bond, it's much like the reason why you have your mother, when you were a child, read you a bedtime story. You respected your mother, you loved your mother, that was part of the communication process. Otherwise, it's just going to be disembodied storytelling in bits and pieces on the internet. And the one thing that the people who go to the internet do not have is time. So if they trust you and they like the way you tell a story, they're going to come back again and again. About 9 million people watch these stories on the Today Show. But last year I had 4 stories that had 40 to 70 million page views on MSNBC.com. And that meant that they had to actually watch a 30 or 20-second commercial before they watched the story. So if that's the case and you want to continue to be able to tell thoughtful stories in any form or fashion, when you go to the people who sign paychecks and in the front office and you actually have some eyeballs and you've got a story that has, like this one, you could watch it now or you could watch it 5 years from now, it's the same effect. Then I think the whole concept of being a professional journalist is focused again on the storytelling, which can last, and there would be an economic reason for it to last because you're actually bringing people into the corral. The non-question question. I can't emphasize so much that all good reporting starts with how you ask questions and put people at ease, or confront people. Either way, but it all comes down to the questioning. I want to show you a story about a guy who I bumped into out in Colorado, and I went there for one story and came back with another only because I sat and listened to him and never asked him the follow-up question, so he filled in a story that I had no idea, and it helped turn the corner. So especially in a longer piece, if you've got some kind of surprise that you can build in that's going to shift the story, then you the best emails I get are, well, you may be late for the bus again today. Nobody wants to wait. Nobody wants to leave in the middle of the story because they see some foreshadowing that something might be added at the end that they really need to see. So this one's called Farm to Fame.
Today's American Story with Bob Dotson begins in Centennial, Colorado, but ends where you won't believe. You see, this one is for all of us who sing in the shower and then dare to dream.
In most of the country, time is cut in tiny slices, too thin for thought. But out here on the high plains, the rhythm of life is different. From dawn to dusk, Chuck Taylor would listen to the radio and wonder why he wasn't making music.
Look around you, there's beauty and music everywhere. I wanted to do my part. I wanted to express what I was feeling.
He also thought it might be a good way to meet girls.
I wanted to be a rock star, but Meatloaf already kind of conquered the chubby long-haired guy thing back in the 70s.
So one day, the farmhand from Centennial, Colorado, auditioned for something else. Elizabeth Elliott, the opera director in Fort Collins, was stunned.
Brought tears to my eyes. It's not often that somebody comes in and sings something that just makes your spine straighten, and it wasn't just the voice. Chuck has soul.
May I suggest you think it over?
Just 18 months after this first role in Colorado, he won a national audition to sing full-time at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. The only Italian he knew was double latte.
I'm a college dropout. I was a high school dropout before that. I could barely read them little black dots on the page.
You're a Metropolitan Opera singer. You can't. How do you do it?
I hire somebody or have a good enough friend that plays piano to plunk down the notes on a mini disc recorder for me.
Talent got him here. Hard work put him center stage. This month, 6 years after leaving the farm, Chuck, now Charles Taylor, has a leading role in the largest opera house in the world.
I still fight with the feeling of being a fraud.
But he has lived the kind of life they write about in operas.
I should be dead, or at the very least probably in jail or in a box somewhere, begging change. And here I am living this dream.
Taylor loved hitting high notes, but loved getting high better. He was kicked out of school for drinking, started taking drugs, eventually ended up homeless and living in a van. At 24, after the deaths of several of his friends, he hit bottom.
I really thought I was helpless and hopeless. Take time, go back and...
Until music became his lifeline.
So you're trying to woo this chick, all right?
Okay.
So, woo me.
Chuck is also teaching at Colorado State University, the school he did not graduate.
It's better.
Better?
It's better, yeah.
You're one big Cinderella to them.
You should see me in a tutu.
Do you know Ricky Martin?
He has learned to have fun without drugs. Not serious, but sober 11 years. Chuck even found that girl he went looking for when he left the farm and managed a storybook ending.
Chuck is the kind of guy that people want to be around.
Just to see what will happen next.
So what are you going to do when the fat lady sings on your opera career?
I'm going to get back home, get back out here.
Where the rivers twist and turn, a mirror of his life. The one that could have ended tragically, like the operas he sings. For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story in New York City.
So, a simple observation when I was doing the story, I said, boy, you're getting a late start in life. It wasn't a question. And that, with the silence, prompted the second side and much more interesting side of the story. I show you that piece because it came from a press release. And the Metropolitan Opera sent me this press release and said, hey, this cowboy is now going to be the leading man in our opera. And you ought to come do the story about it. And that's what everybody else did, too. They went and did this story. So much of what we do today, because our time is sliced too thin for thought, is repackaging someone else's press release and putting it out on our air. And someone who we are doing a story about will tell us how we should spin the story, what's important about the story. And you go through your bullet points and then you move on to your next story. All of which, I think, is totally forgettable. So you need to try to get to that second level, which is, what's the rest of the story? What does this story mean? I always ask myself when I sit down to write a story, if there's a group of kids on an island off the coast of South Carolina who won a writing contest, and it's a remote little island and there's maybe a dozen kids on there, how did they do it? How are these kids any different, if that's my story? How are these kids any different than any other kids? And then maybe you come up with your theme, which my theme on that particular story was, sometimes your mind can be your best friend. If it's so remote and there's no one to play with, except for the 3 or 4 fellows who are with you on the sand, you're going to sit down and start to doodle. You're going to start doing something. So I think the first step we've got to do in order to take back this content is to say to ourselves, how can I make this story unique? Now, you won't, but it's a good goal to try to find that inner voice in every story that only you can see. I think the definition of a storyteller is someone who shows you something that you might miss even standing next to him. To connect what seems to be unconnected. And you do that by asking questions that will bring people out and have them fill in better stories than you think you would do. Like, for instance, the other day there was a young kid from South Carolina who won a contest to be able to conduct the Boston Symphony. And of course their PR people sent it out, and Good Morning America, our competition, they had the conductor of the orchestra on live, and they said at the very top of their story that this young boy conducted the orchestra last night and it was his dream. And then they spent the rest of the time talking to the conductor of the orchestra from Boston because that was in the press release. So what? Okay, another story about some kid who got his dream. Instead, we did this. If you look at PopStream, if Mario, if you would go down to the story called PopStream, it's number 4, and take a look and see how we tried to find the individual voice.
An 18-year-old from Goose Creek, South Carolina, had a dream that seemed impossibly out of his grasp. But when the Boston Pops came to his home state Tuesday night, it actually came true. NBC's Bob Dotson has that story.
Braden Kirchner likes to conduct music with his eyes closed so he can see his dream. He wants to join John Williams and Arthur Fiedler and Keith Lockhart, the select few who have conducted the Boston Pops.
What do you and Keith Lockhart have in common?
Both young and handsome.
And he's more confident than I am.
Never mind that Braden is just 18. To prepare for a career in conducting, he's learning to play every instrument in the orchestra. 12 so far.
If I gave you orders and I didn't play your instrument, you wouldn't take that order as seriously. No, 1, 2, 3, 1.
Okay.
The friends Braden tutors in Goose Creek, South Carolina know he's serious.
Good, but when you do it, don't go. Just do it.
While they hung out last summer, doing what teenagers do, he worked 11 jobs.
I have it planned out. See?
He told his mom, Diane, he needed $10,000.
Which I will do
fast.
It's a little shock to me because at that time I just lost my job.
The boy with a dream had seen an ad on the internet saying fans could conduct the Boston Pops if they donated big bucks to the orchestra.
It's just money. And if that can buy you the thing that you wanted all your life, then it's worth it to me.
Braden could have had a fundraiser to get the cash. He did not. Instead, he mowed most of the yards in the neighborhood, worked the overnight shift at the Waffle House, delivered newspapers and pizzas. 6 months later, he had $5,000, half the money he needed.
There were a lot of people talking behind the scenes that when the time came, we would make sure he got there.
Please welcome in his Boston Pops conducting debut, Braden Kirchner.
Turns out that $5,000 was enough. Last night, the Pops performed in South Carolina, just down the road from Goose Creek, with a new guest conductor. Standing on that stage, Braden tallied up what his dream had cost.
All the hundreds of yards I mowed and the hundreds of cars I washed and all the late night jobs.
Is the bill a bargain?
I could buy a new car, but it would rust and break down in 20 years. And then this is something that I'll always have with me.
Oh, he'll have something more than a memory. The Pops return Braden's money to help him pay for college. Some things aren't bought. They're earned.
My heart jumped out of my chest. It was the coolest thing I've ever experienced.
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, Goose Creek, South Carolina.
I wish I could do it again.
If you find ordinary people who are living ordinary lives passionately, they sell your story. Always remember, even if you're a writer or an editor or a producer, to learn to think visually. We shot that entire story with one camera, and we shot that entire story in about 35 minutes. Now, how did we do that? We went and we said, we know that he's going to have one song that he gets to do, and we asked the conductor and the concertmaster, what other pieces that do you play in the first half of the symphony that has the same beat, the same cadence? And then we did a series of close-ups, so that when we cut the pieces together, it looked as if we had 1,000 cameras. And then we asked the local affiliate, on the one shot where the flag came down, I said, would you at least get the wide shot and I'll give you a copy of everything we do. So we did. We got it all together. So, for instance, if you go out to a flood, and it's a day 2 of the flood, and you shoot normally and you write a normal story, it's not enough. But if you go into someone's home and you notice that there's dirt on the apples that are sitting on the counter of the kitchen, then you can write a line like, the flood was so high and came so fast that it left dust on Mrs. Smith's apples. Now suddenly you've got an image that that is not generic, it's specific. And I call it writing to the corners of the picture. You don't spend a lot of time saying, oh, this woman is skinny, or it was a raging water, because you've got natural sound and you've got the water going through. But for instance, if you have a big tornado that's come through and it's been through a pine forest, maybe you could add some information at the beginning of the story, like you could smell the path of the storm before you could see it. The sun had not come up as we flew into this tornado alley, where the tornado was 5 miles across and 100 miles long through a pine forest. So you've opened up your senses, you've told the audience something that they can't hear and they can't see, but you've elicited another emotion, another sense, and that is the sense of smell. Because what you're trying to do all the time is to set the scene and not just show or tell, but have them experience what you saw. So let's break down a story, and all stories are like this, whether they're a headline or whether they're a long story. All stories start with a scene setter. All stories have foreshadowing. All stories have conflict, which is simple in journalism because everything we do has conflict. It has character development. Something has to happen. I mean, look at Braden. Braden just started off as just your regular teenager, but because he wanted to do this, he changed in his life. And oh, by the way, after he graduated from high school, he went on and served over in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and he's now back as a music teacher in that same high school. That's Braden Kirchner. So you take all these things, the scene setter, the foreshadowing, the character development, the conflict, and then you finally have resolution. I want to show you a story called Life in a Jar, Mario. A story about 4 girls in Kansas who tipped me to something they had been doing most of their young lives that professional journalists had tried to do, but they were successful because they did the same thing we've been talking about tonight.
Today's American Story with Bob Dotson comes from Kansas, where 4 girls in a small town discovered someone very special hiding in history's shadows. She's a woman a world away who saved the lives of 2,500 children and is now on the list for a Nobel Peace Prize.
The keys to history's treasures are often found in unexpected places. This one turned up in a tiny Kansas town, unlocking a story half a world away.
To my dear and beloved girls very close to my heart.
Irina Sendler saved 2,500 children from the Nazi death camps during World War II. She saved her story 60 years for the first child who asked why she risked her life.
My parents have taught me that if someone is drowning, one always needs to give a helping hand and rescue them.
Megan Felt and her friends were putting together a play for their high school history club and found a brief mention of Mrs. Sendler.
It's like it took a hold of us and we couldn't quit. We wanted to know more. We wanted to dig deeper.
So they went to Poland to meet her.
That's a beautiful picture.
And this is the high school play she helped them write.
Isaac, Hannah, this nice lady is going to take you someplace safe.
In 1940, the Nazis walled off a neighborhood near Irina Sendler's home in Warsaw, pressed almost 500,000 people into an area the size of New York Central Park, with not enough food to keep them alive. 5,000 were dying each month. Sendler, a Catholic nurse, bluffed her way inside.
We can walk right past the German officers.
I lost no time on reflecting, knowing that I and my heart had to be there to come to the rescue.
She's only 5 feet tall.
She's less than 5 feet tall, yes. And she's walking out of the ghetto with gunny sacks
and driving out hygiene trucks with babies sedated.
The tiny ones she'd put in boxes, and sometimes they would make noise, but she had a dog sitting beside her. What did she do in order to cover up the cries?
If they got close to the child, she would hit the dog on the paw and it would start to bark and cause chaos, so they had to let her go through. Children, take my hands.
She took the children to Catholic families who agreed to raise them as their own, but wrote their real names on cigarette papers and put them in a jar, which she buried beneath an apple tree across the street from the Nazi barracks.
I know you were not the mother of that child.
One day, Irina Sendler was betrayed, arrested, both her feet and legs broken, almost murdered. But she never revealed where she'd taken the kids. After the war, she quietly dug up the jars and, true to her word, began returning the children to surviving relatives.
One person has the ability to change people.
Mrs. Sendler had a question for you girls. She wondered why you would care when you came from a place that didn't have a Jewish family for miles and miles and miles.
Race, religion, creed, it didn't matter to us. What mattered was good can triumph over evil.
Mrs. Sendler bid them goodbye with a bit of advice. Become like the farmers back here in Kansas, she said. Don't sow seed for food, sow the seeds for good. And try to make that circle of good around you bigger and bigger every day.
This will all end someday.
So the curtain never came down on their little play.
Sign your name, please.
Not even after they graduated, got jobs, got married.
We're trying to repair the world.
Norm Kennard, their high school history teacher, has watched them perform in more than 200 schools.
They're reaching over the walls of bias and prejudice that adults could never attempt to reach over.
Telling the tale of a 97-year-old woman that might have been lost forever had it not been for some small-town kids intent on rescuing the rescuer's story.
I can only follow the need of my heart.
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story in Uniontown, Kansas.
We're going to take your questions in just a moment, but I wanted to kind of break down how we did that story. First of all, we didn't go to Poland. That was home movie. But the reason we didn't go to Poland was it's a story about you, meaning Kansas, young girls, teenagers. It's not about this older lady in Warsaw entirely. It's about what happened to these young girls, what motivated them, how did it change their lives. So we rooted it, hey, get their attention. What's the mystery here that we need to unlock? You, it's about you, just like everybody else. You live in a place here in the United States and off you go. So the first thing was the scene setter. Scene setter was Kansas, not Warsaw. It's about us. The foreshadowing, the keys to history's treasures are often found in unexpected places. Now you're not going to turn off. You want to find out where it is, right? And then this one turned up in a tiny Kansas town unlocking a story half a world away. The conflict is obvious. It's World War II. But more than that, it's how small town kids could overcome prejudice and race and make a difference in their life. So there were actually two stories going at the same time. The character growth was, the beginning was just a history lesson, but look how it changed their life. And the resolution was telling a tale of a 97-year-old woman that might have been lost if the kids had not rescued the rescuer's story. Now that's not florid writing, it's just the observation of what you learn from watching these kids. And it was done cheaply, it was done quickly, and it was effective. So if you got questions, I'm ready to answer them. Anybody here in the studio?
Well, I noticed that the cadence of your, the structure of your stories tends to be probably not much more than one sentence before you have a grab or an upshot.
That's true.
Yeah.
I feel like the more time I can leave for natural sound and or music and or pacing of pictures, or just, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to write silence. But for the audience, sometimes that can be the most effective. So you set up something that's going to happen and you just stop talking and let it happen. So people who, I mean, I don't know if you're like me, but I don't watch television. I listen to it, and then when something's happened, I turn my head to see what's going on, because you're trying to get your kids ready to school, or you're getting, So what I do is I build in certain things that, what's he saying? He's not saying anything. What's going on? And so they bring the eyeballs back to the set. These are all little techniques that I use to try to keep people from wandering or clicking away, So many times we set up a story and we give it all in the headline, right? And then we spend the next 30 seconds telling you what you've just seen. Well, you know that you're the only person talking at that point because they've clicked away, either mentally or to another station. So what I try to do is say, stick with me because something else is going to happen, and I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. All the way through the spot, whether the spot's 12 seconds or an hour, same way. That's the way I structure it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, the story about the farm boy, the opera singer, a tendency with us would have been to bring the piece about him being an alcoholic and a drug addict up to the top of the story rather than where you put it. Why did you structure it that way? Because that would have been the hay part of it, wouldn't it?
Well, I think it's more, my opinion is, it's more effective once you know the context of the story. So I say that you need, for the scene setter, to say, who is this guy? And what's going on? And then just when you think you know everything about him, you peel back another layer. So if you start with the drug addict part of it, the drug addict is the guy who did all this, then they're not going to hear anything else. And it's going to be repetitious from the headline. So what I do is, instead of that, I use the foreshadowing of, here's this fella who comes from an unusual place, and he just did this to meet girls, and isn't this kind of cool? And just when you think, okay, this is, and then you turn the corner on him. And so at that point, you've already got the context that helps to make it, I think, a little deeper story, rather than to headline it, and then where do you go from there? Ronald Reagan used to say, save something for the third act. So I try to do it in such a way that you'll get to the third act. I don't mean that you don't, but the old days of just headlining it and then backfilling, I don't think works in a computer age when people are just skimming through your newscast. I mean, this is like, put your viewer on your knee and say, once upon a time there was this guy out in Colorado, and then you think you know everything about him, here's something else. You think you know something about it, here's something else. And that's pretty much how I structure stories. Steve Carey in Melbourne, have you got a question?
Yeah, I do. Just to prove we're here, Bob.
Thanks for staying awake, Steve.
But I was interested with Braden. You said that he was in Afghanistan and everywhere else afterwards. Did you go back and actually do a follow-up story, and if not, why not?
I haven't done a follow-up story per se, but I did an hour special on some of my stories that aired on Christmas Eve last year, and I updated them, on camera. But it would be great to go back and do it. But my present boss would much rather have me do something new each time, and so because he still lets me do these stories, which I think is terrific after 35 years, I try to fulfill his obligation. But I think that he would be terrific, and he's in my back pocket. I'd love to go back and do that, because it's just a natural. Anybody else out there in TV land? Oh, hello.
When you were saying about the young conductor, you said that was a very quick story that you shot. When you come to do an interview with your main talent, normally, I would kind of spend a bit of time with them. Did you spend a lot of time with him to get what you wanted out of him? Have you got tricks to do things quickly? I mean, what you were saying is that you tend to listen, so therefore that's a lot of time that you should spend with that person. Do you go in thinking you're going to spend a lot of time with your main interview?
Absolutely. That's my background is documentary film. So I'm going to be down there anyway. To get to Goose Creek takes forever. So what are you going to do, sit in the car, while they go out and shoot cover film? So I figured, if nothing else, just being near this boy through the day, where he can get comfortable with me, so that when I actually sit down to ask him questions, I'm not a stranger to him. That helps. But also, by listening to what his mother says and what his friends say and what he says in unguarded moments, you start to get a deeper insight into his life and his motivation. In fact, we didn't know all the things he had done to get this opportunity. We knew that he'd worked on it, and we thought that's going to be enough. But by being there long enough to get a sense of your subject, I think you end up getting better answers to your questions, not just for sound bites, but also to get a little deeper understanding of the story.
Yep, thanks.
Linda Kincaid in Melbourne.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
Just checking, you talked about spending 35 minutes on various shoots. How long is the turnaround normally for each story?
Well, it depends. You know, it's the old saying, if you got a week, you're going to take a week. And but normally what we do is a lot of pre-planning because it's expensive to go out and do things. And I go through maybe 600 to 1,000 story ideas a month. I do, and my producer and research that I've got. And out of that, we may get a dozen that we think might work. And we spend a lot of time on the phone to try to get some sense of what is available. And then we go out and shoot it. You usually shoot it in a day, which includes maybe getting there. But the United States is a big place, so sometimes it takes a day and a half to do it. And then we come back, and I'm one of these old-fashioned reporters who looks at everything, and I log it. And I find where all the natural sound is, because to me, it's just like a jazz ensemble. It's not just the words that I'm writing, but if somebody has said something in natural sound that makes the point, I can use that as well as when I write it, so that when we go back into the edit room, it's much more efficient to edit. And it's the same way if you were by yourself and you were editing this on your laptop. The more you think about it ahead of time, the less time you have to spend messing with it when you actually get to physically editing it.
Hi, Bob.
Yes.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing this with us, mate. It's fantastic stuff, really interesting. Something I work for the Sunday night program, one of our flagship current affairs programs. You sound very much like you don't make a lot of decisions before you actually get out into the field. I mean, do you sit there and write a shooting script? Do you obviously get as much information as possible, but it sounds like a lot of what happens for you evolves when you're actually out there with the people. Would that be right?
That's correct. You know, there's that old saying about the fog of war. You make a detailed plan. I know exactly how this story is going to go. I got the clothes, and then I get out there and the sun comes up in the west, and I'm going, well, that's not going to work. So I think the difference is you know, how quickly you can change gears and how open you are to changing your approach. But that doesn't mean you haven't researched it to the nth degree and you have plan A, plan B, plan C, because if nothing else happens, you at least got that. But of course, the reality, once you set that up, you will be able to change when you see something or add to it and you say, oh, here's how it changes and this is how it works. And then also, almost anybody who's on a story with me, I have no ego when it comes to good ideas. And I think sometimes ego can stand in the way of a really good story because you've got a preconceived notion and for the moment you're in charge. And it's not as good as the person who was taking the pictures, you know, who says, well, this is terrific. Like, for instance, if I'm out on a story, breaking news story back in the day, and I didn't shoot any of it, and it's all come in to Channel 7 ahead of time, I have two questions. I said, what's your best picture and what's your most memorable picture? Not always the same. The most memorable picture, I always try to build towards that line, that image, and the best picture I try to open with. And if it's all, you know, if it's a mosquito flying around, then I'll do the whole thing on a mosquito because it's already grabbed you, rather than to write the script and say, all right, paste some pictures to it. And it's hardly ever as strong as if you have some sense of what the best visuals are. Now, of course, if you have no visuals, there's lots of different ways to do it, kind of like with The Life in a Jar. I mean, we had a really bad play that these kids did, and it hasn't gotten better in the last 10 years. And we had scratchy black and white footage, right? And we had really badly shot home movies in Poland. And that's pretty much what we had for a 5-minute piece. But we took the challenge and turned it around. Once you get into the story about what these girls were doing, you don't care whether it was bad. And you only bring up the one or two little pieces of natural sound in which the actresses are not bad. They're pretty good. And so now the people are hooked into the story, so the challenges kind of fade into the background. So you use the best you've got. I mean, it's like the only piece of advice that I really have kept throughout my entire career is, it was a piece of chocolate with a kind of a, you know, like a fortune cookie line in it, and it said, success is not a question of being dealt a good hand. It's playing a bad hand well over and over and over again. And that's pretty much what we're faced with. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough energy. We got too many stories to do. But instead of going out and painting oils, paint a watercolor. Get 3 vibrant things that work, which separates your story from everybody else who's gone out to do the same story. And it keeps you awake, keeps you alive, and it keeps you going, and maybe keeps your paycheck coming. So that's the important thing, is that whatever works, you try to figure out how this is going to work visually, and then use your best stuff. And then work everything else around what is going to grab them visually, whether it's a graphic, if you're in a story, you're doing an economic story or something like that, has no pictures, there's ways to grab them, whether it's a great soundbite or a great piece of graphic or whatever. But use your best stuff and then let it grow from that. You always get in trouble if you go the other way around and say, this is my story and I've written it and then you guys fill it in. Well, and there's big gaps where it just doesn't grab you. And I want every second to push the narrative forward. Hello, Jeff. Jeff Bruce. Hi.
Just thinking about the idea of the path less travelled with the Boston Pops. Often the work situations we find ourselves in, you're fairly restricted to doing an all-in or a press conference where everyone else gets to see what you're doing. Do you have any tips for how in that transparent environment to still give yourself the path that the others aren't following?
Well, for instance, if you go into a news conference where they're going to be talking about the new sewer system in Sydney, you know ahead of time kind of what it is. Now, you may not know what they're going to say, but I would spend 5 minutes, finding somebody who might be affected by the new sewer on the way to the press conference, so you can fit the press conference in for what it's worth, but you don't have to hang with it. You can go to a woman who says, "By God, it's been stinking out here all summer." Well, suddenly people are seeing themselves on television talking about what the problem is, and then when the mayor says, "Well, we're going to give $100,000 and we're going to start on Pitt and we're going to go right down to Hyde." Okay, great. We'll use that soundbite, but maybe the more important one was with the little lady and the fact that she's finding all the stink in her neighborhood. So that's what I try to do. I try to anticipate from the minute that I'm assigned a story or think I'm going to go do something, whether it's breaking news or whatever. I try to figure out how to get a step ahead of the competition visually or with an element they may not have, and it probably won't come from the press conference.
Well, being an executive, I'm relentlessly negative. But when you look at a television story, what makes you wince? Are there any particular things that make you wince and cringe?
One of my pet peeves is ending the story with a soundbite. Because my grandmother used to say, "Well, that's not you talking," and then you put your name right after that lady, You're a storyteller. You've put the audience on your knee, and you need to have a closing thought. Now, okay, some people say, "This soundbite was so terrific, I couldn't top it." Okay, then react to it. You're the storyteller. It's your 35 seconds. So these are things that people have learned 1,000 years ago. If you can't top the final picture, if you can't come up with a good line that you can play off on, you can at least go, "Wow," or "Who knew?" or something, because that's what the audience is going to be doing. So if you chop it off and you don't have the beginning, the middle, and the ending, then you're no different than what's running on YouTube. And you don't want to be no different than what's running on YouTube. When I was a young reporter, they used to send me out to do sports on Friday nights, and they'd say, "Just shoot the touchdowns because we don't have enough money for the film." I said, "Great, let me know when the touchdowns come." Well, that's a little bit like, you're waiting on the computer for something to go viral. Well, if you knew when it was going to go viral, that'd be a terrific way of doing it, but you never know. There's still 1,000, images of somebody's cat playing with a ball, and that's what you mostly get when you go there. So in our case, we're trying to figure out a way to make your story unique. And content-driven story begins with the storyteller. Now, you are not the story. And in the last 10, 15 years, most television reporters have become the story. They're better known than the story. They ride the elephant. But I tell you that if you go out and you find the guy that has nurtured this little elephant up to be a big elephant, you're going to have people in tears. And yet, if you ride the elephant yourself consistently and over again, they've seen that act. See what I mean? So it's not that you drastically change how you do things, but you try to find small incremental changes that makes your story stand apart. And I think that the easiest way to do that is continuing to find passionate, ordinary people who can be the central characters in your story and see how the story affects them. If the sewer is backing up, it's Gloria's problem, it's not the mayor's. The mayor is an element, but he's not the key to it that separates you from everybody else at the press conference.
Bob.
There's Michael Coons in Brisbane first, and then I'll get yours. So Michael?
Bob, I'm just interested. You must have seen so many changes over those 35 years on the way a story is told and the way a story is presented and packaged. What do you see are the constants of a good news story? What hasn't changed and what won't change? And perhaps in the future, how do you see the way our stories being told changing?
Well, I think a good story always has all the elements we've been talking about, and that changes, but it changes at the risk of having people find us irrelevant because they don't see the storytelling aspect of it. So I always try to go back to that, hey, you see so. Where am I on that? That has not changed. I mean, this is Shakespeare probably had the same thing. Hey, this is Macbeth, and we're going to kill him in the first act. And I was in Dublin the other day, and they still have newspapers there that are flourishing. And I was out having a beer with one of the reporters. Imagine a reporter drinking. And I asked him, I said, how come you guys are still around when every other newspaper is having trouble? And he said, well, we saw it was coming. And we went back to the basics of storytelling, and we went and we found novelists, and we asked them if they would become the rim editors for each one of the pages, sports, living, whatever. And he says, the reporters and the producers were going crazy. They said, what would novelists know that we don't know? We're the experts, we're in journalism. And he says, and tell about the first week. Because then we realized that the novelists would say to us, this is a story on the front page that you've written about a stabbing death downtown. Well, let me know when you get to the point of your story when the suspect raises the knife, and that's when we will end the story on page 1 and move it to page 2. Because it's like a good mystery novel. So you'll get people to read the whole story. He was going back to the classic way of telling a story. And just throwing out information, which we can do now because of the internet and Google, is not enough. So that hasn't changed. What has changed is that there are a number of journalism outlets that have forgotten the basics of storytelling because the delivery is so difficult. We pat ourselves on the back when the circus tent is up, when we forget that people don't go to the circus to look at the tent. They just assume it's going to be there. So I guess my only message is, if you go back to the basics and make sure your story, whether it's a headline or a minute 10 or whatever, or some blog that you've got to write, that goes with it, has all those elements about scene setting and foreshadowing and all that, and hey, you see so, and you've got really good sound bites because you've been asking the non-question questions and stuff, you're going to ratchet up your story level to a point where it's going to be separated from the guy, not only the people in the next station, but also the people in the desk sitting next to you who get to the point where they're just turning it out. You don't want to do that. You for no other reason, just to stay awake. Yes, sir.
Oh, Bob, who was your mentor, and what was the most important thing he taught you, or she?
Well, I've been a sponge all my life. I've learned from people who do it well and people who do it badly. Because I think, you can learn as much from people who are screwing up around you and going, I ain't going to do that, But there was one fellow by the name of Charles Kuralt. Kuralt was the first American television journalist to convince the people who signed paychecks that there were stories between those clusters of bright lights. And he would go out in a recreational vehicle and disappear for weeks at a time and come back with these lovely little stories about us. And I finally got to meet him one day. And I had stopped watching him because my news director said, you're starting to sound like Kuralt Light. Because everybody wanted to be Charles Kuralt, And so for like 15 years, I didn't actually watch any more of his stories, but I still admired him. Finally, I met him, and he said, Bob, all the money in the world is sitting on a stool in New York City, but all the fun is out there. And the other thing I want to tell you is, never let the boss know where you are. And that worked in the 1970s and 80s. Of course, it wouldn't work today. But that's what he would do. He would go out and he would come back with a better story than he was assigned. And so it was one less problem that the people who have to sign paychecks had to deal with. They knew if Charlie went out, he'd come back with something better than they thought, that they'd assigned. He'd always put that little spin to it. He'd always find something better. And for instance, one of the things I learned, I went with him on a story when I was in graduate school at Syracuse University, and he happened to be around there. So I called him up, and he was nice enough to let me go. And he said, I'm going to do this story down the road. But as we were going along, he sees that there's a group of people in the summertime out on the front lawn of their house in a small town, and they've got a banner, and it says, "Welcome home, Bill." So of course he stops, and he and Izzy Bleckman, his cameraman, got out, and I said, I thought we were supposed to go, because I'm still thinking like a journalist. When will we have this assignment? And he says, no, this is interesting. This is a guy coming back from Vietnam, and we need to do this. So he did this lovely thing with all these people waiting for Bill. And then he confounded the cameraman and me by saying, okay, let's leave. And they said, but Bill's going to be here in 10 minutes. That's your closing shot. And he says, it's a better story if nobody knows what Bill looks like. It's still a mystery about Bill, because then the focus is on the people waiting for Bill and not Bill himself, because we've seen 1,000 stories of GIs coming home. So we don't let the GI come home. We just do the story about the anticipation that Bill's coming home. Well, it was a knockout story. I was watching how he did it, and I'm thinking, this guy, today we would say, oh, he's thinking out of the box. No, he wasn't. He was saying, I've seen 1,000 stories done the other way, and it's not that it's good or bad, but I've seen it. So he was moving beyond the cliche. And that's why Charles Correll had this long, long career of people leaving him alone, and he went out, and he used to call it like, he says, it's not about the money, Bob, it's about the pie. Every day you get up and you figure out where the best pie is, and you go find it and have a piece. That's what life is all about, So I love the guy. And he had a long career, ended up as an anchor on CBS, and then died on the 4th of July, which I thought was kind of cool, Question? Carrie, playing?
Yep.
Okay, Carrie. Hi.
Bob, the stories you've shown us and the technique you've described works for what we might call human interest or colour stories. The old rule in writing hard news has always been to put the hard facts at the top. And I just wonder how you apply So I've missed one.
Hey, you see so?
Hey, you see so, yeah. How you apply that to, say, the political round or the crime round?
All right, well, that's a good thing, because we have a story called Wrong Man, and it's exactly what you're talking about. Why don't we take a look at that, and then we'll talk about what we did differently than if you were just doing a narrative story.
The crime was incredibly violent. Deborah Sykes, a 25-year-old newspaper copy editor, beaten, raped, and stabbed 16 times. Attacked in the early morning on a downtown street in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Her body dumped in this small, rundown park 20 years ago.
It was a very loud scream.
Witnesses identified 19-year-old Darrell Hunt as the killer, even though he did not fit the initial descriptions given police.
He's a robber, and a rapist, and a kidnapper, and a sadistic butcher.
There was no physical evidence linking Hunt to the crime, but he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 2 separate trials.
Your attorneys came to you at that second trial and offered you a deal that they said would be reasonable.
Yes.
Plead guilty and get off for time served.
Yes.
Was it tempting?
No, because I didn't commit the crime. And I thought it would be an injustice not only to myself, but to Mrs. Sykes and her family.
A decade ago, advances in DNA testing ruled Hunt out as the rapist. But since he also was convicted of her murder, he remained in prison for 18 years.
How did you keep the bitterness from sinking you?
Anger and bitterness eats you up from the inside. I wanted to live.
That's why he married April, his longtime friend, in a prison wedding 4 years ago.
he may not ever get out.
And if you'd never been able to be with him?
I have him in the next life.
She did not have to wait that long. An extraordinary sequence of events set forth the truth. Judge Andy Cromer ordered crime lab technicians to compare the DNA evidence with a database of state prisoners. That led investigators to this man, Willard Brown, whose DNA, they said, matched the semen taken from Deborah Sykes' body.
He's made a statement that he is responsible for the crime and he acted alone.
They found Brown in jail, serving 60 days on a parole violation.
Myself and Agent Williams took custody of him at 11:15. He was due to be released at 12 o'clock.
Hunt was not entirely free yet, merely released on bond, while detectives made sure he wasn't an accomplice to the murder.
Good morning.
What they found was astounding. Willard Brown had been identified in a lineup as a rapist before, less than 6 months after Deborah Sykes was attacked. While Darrell Hunt was awaiting trial for his life, another woman was abducted just 3 blocks from where Mrs. Sykes was murdered. There were striking similarities between the two crimes. Both women were in their early 20s, both on their way to work in the early morning, both repeatedly stabbed. But the second rape victim survived and refused to press charges, so no one was ever prosecuted for that crime. In March 1986, detectives did interview Brown about the Sykes case, but mistakenly thought he was in prison at the time of the rape. So they let him go. Last November, Winston-Salem Police Chief Linda Davis told an investigator to check again.
He found that Willard Brown was released from prison in June of 1984, prior to the August murder of Deborah Sykes.
So Darrell Hunt spent half his life in prison because of a typo.
If we had had access to all the information, we would have known about Willard Brown before the first trial.
Sometimes it takes a long time to find the truth, longer still to accept it. Deborah Sykes' mother, Evelyn Jefferson, showed up at the hearing to dismiss charges against Hunt.
I do not believe in Mr. Hunt's innocence. And I believe that what you're about to do here today is set free a guilty man who's guilty of my daughter's death.
But Judge Cromer said the words Hunt had been waiting for all these years.
Today, we acknowledge a mistake was made. We will dismiss this case with prejudice.
Before Hunt left a free man, he spoke from his heart to Mrs. Sykes' mother.
As hard as it is for me, Miss Jefferson, I had nothing to do. Let me go. I know it's hard. People talk about closure, but there will never be closure because closure means you forget something. That was her daughter, so she'll never have closure. You just ask for a peace.
There are many victims in such a case, not just the people leaving this court. When our judicial system fails, all of us are victims. For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So you see, a very straightforward story. There are some techniques that I tried to do, because a lot of it had to be on camera. So we did the floating camera. We did the transition to walking outside so that you kept the mood going while you were filling in the information. But again, we used the narrative approach to build to the point that he was convicted of on account of a typo. We also did a couple other things. Again, thinking visually, I went to the judge and I said, you know, you've got an overflow crowd, because there's great interest in this story. And I said, you've got a second camera. I mean, you've got a monitor downstairs in the courthouse so people can watch it. Since you're going to have a camera for that, why don't we have 2 cameras in the courtroom? So we got a second camera in there. Now, we had another challenge. Just as he turns to tell Deborah Sykes' mother how sorry he is that she's had to live with this as well as he, of course, turns away from the microphone. So I made sure that during my interview of him, not only did I ask the question again,
but created the same mood for his answer so that I could make the transition from the courtroom to him continuing his thought in the interview, so you didn't break the pace or the mood. So you can still use these craft techniques in order to tell a rather straightforward crime story, and it's and the end of it, which is he walked free. And because we had the two cameras in there, we were able to stop talking for a second and let the emotion build and let people experience watching television what we'd experienced in the courtroom. And that's very rare. So that's how I worked on that. Now we have one other fellow, Pete Doherty in Brisbane.
Bob, I'm wondering, you would have worked with, I imagine, thousands of cameramen over your years. How do you work to get the best out of the cameramen you've got on a given day? What tips have you picked up in that area?
Well, first of all, I assume that I might not be right. That helps a lot with the camera people. But I got a trial early on in my career. I went to Cleveland, Ohio, in the NBC bureau there, and it was really, really cold in Cleveland, Ohio. And in those days, we had like 5 people that would go out on a story together. The cameraman, the electrician, the sound person, and the producer. Well, always the editor, or the sound guy, was the oldest. And he introduced himself to me, Frank Green, and he said, I always sit by the heater in the front of the car. I said, okay. And he says, and you sit in the back. And the producer sits behind the driver, who's always the cameraman unless the cameraman's tired, and the producer can slap him on the corner and tell him which way to turn. And if he doesn't want to drive, we get 40 Watt, the electrician, he drives. And that's the way it is. And remember, I was here before you came, and I'm going to be here before you go. I said, okay. So we were out shooting a story. He hadn't had lunch. He pulled the plug, and he went and sat in the car. We didn't have the story. And I went back and I talked to the news director, and I didn't say Frank had a problem. I just said, Frank needs to have dinner. He has to have lunch. And if we were going to do 4 stories a day, it isn't going to work. So can we kind of work it so that he gets lunch? And instead of turning him in, I figured out what made him happy, which is warmth and lunch. And so about a week later, he comes up and he goes, hey, how come you didn't turn me in? And I said, well, I thought you had a point. Suddenly, Frank got to be a better sound man. Whenever he was on a story with me, instead of riding the needle in the red, he was like paying attention. My wife, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, came and we had to take a Learjet right after she got off the plane at our new home down to Cincinnati because the World Series was going on. And Frank came up with the car, and he opened up the door and he says, Mrs. Dotson, would you like to sit by the heater? And the cameraman said, I've worked with Frank for about 15 years. He's never done that for a pregnant nun. So what I try to do is think about everybody who might have their finger on the story as part of a jazz ensemble. And if it's good, it goes in. I don't care if it's my idea, their idea, whatever. Because I know, maybe present company excluded, but I know most people who sign paychecks, they don't know whether or not individual pieces, segments of the story are good. They just like the story, it worked or it didn't work. So, we may have come over on different boats, but we're in the same boat now. So what I try to do is to give them a chance to create like I'm trying to create. And that means that if the cameraman climbs to the very top of the mountain to take a shot, by God, you're going to put that shot in. You're going to find a place for it because he's not going to climb up there the next time. And so that's how I do it. I try to work with it. And many people who I thought were going to be just slugs have become better, and vice versa, because there are going to be days when I don't have a clue or an idea, and then they save me. Question from the floor? Yes, ma'am.
My question relates to celebrity interviews and actors on junkets, where you've only got, for example, 2 minutes, and they're obviously trying to plug to a movie, and they're quite experienced at selling you a line. How do you, and other outlets have obviously got the same 2 minutes, how do you make your story different or better?
Well, I think it's the same problem we face sometimes with politicians, because they're so good these days on staying on point, and their talking points, which in the United States could go on like for 14 months. Oh, okay. The question, because some people didn't hear it, was what do you do if you're doing a celebrity interview and they're really tightly scripted, and they know exactly what they want to promote, and they're probably not going to say anything else. And I said that it's probably the same with politicians. If you've got 2 minutes, I would say before you start the interviews, look, I'm going to set aside some time to do what we've got to do, which is promote your movie. But this is what my audience would like to know, and I'd like you to discuss it, if you would. And so you lay the ground rules right from the get-go. And it's the same way with a politician. We've heard that story 3,000 times, but would you also, and we'll touch on it, but would you also answer this? Because this is something that I've come up with. So then, as a celebrity interviewer, if you come up with something that is kind of different, and maybe really is, I mean, you look at like Ellen DeGeneres and stuff. When she asks a question on her show, she really brings people out. Now they're comfortable because she herself is a celebrity. So it might be more difficult for us who are journalists to do this. But I think if you have a situation where you can ask the question that people want to know the answer to, and still let the celebrity or the politician know that you'll get around to including why they're there, then maybe you might be surprised to find out that they're kind of fascinated by the fact that they could talk about something else in addition. So that's what I would try.
Bob, thank you very much for your insights. I understand that pre your American Story days, you were in a special projects department. I don't know if you know, but special projects in Australia is code for never to be seen again. So we try to avoid being moved into that department. And my question, I guess, is, do you think the biggest mistake we can make as journalists is to not take risks, particularly in gathering the story and, as you say, taking the different path?
Well, I think that's always the struggle, no matter whether we're journalists or anything in life. You have to make a calculated risk. You can't jump, into something totally different and expect the people that sign paychecks to go along with it, or maybe even the audience. But what I call it is small victories. You look, today the light worked well. The sound actually worked. The computer uplink worked. I got one good question and a decent answer. But if you keep that in the forefront of how you say taking a risk, then you will gradually improve on an overall basis the kinds of stories or the kinds of things you'll try to do. The corollary to that is somewhere along in your life you have to figure out what makes you happy. And in my case, telling stories about folks makes me happy. I love it. It's the only thing I do. I don't play golf. I don't play tennis. When I go home, I try to be a parent so that, I don't become Uncle Daddy. But that's what I do. And so at every point of my career that I had a chance to squirrel back into something I liked, that's what I did. So I didn't follow the traditional path. And it's helped me because I wasn't a threat to the anchor. I wasn't a threat to the news director. All I did was try to do a good story on what I did. So in terms of taking risk, I always took the risk to say, I don't care if it's out of style. Sinatra was around for 1,000 years, Maybe I can do that too if I can figure out a way that it still fits into the current technology and the requirements. And the folks who sign paychecks on the Today Show will let me do a 4 or 5 minute story when everything else runs 2 minutes max, except for maybe an interview that is working pretty well. But that's because I try not to ever give them a B effort. Now, a lot of times they are B efforts, but I try to take the risk that if this is going to make me happy, how can I stay here in this sweet spot? And you've got to decide somewhere along in your career what makes you happy, and don't just let the world push you as an 8-ball. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but at least you're in that process of trying to stay, where you feel like when you go to bed at night, well, that worked pretty well. Whatever it is that you like about the business. And you can still see the same, even if the business changes, and boy, everything that I learned originally is now in a museum. The film gloves, the typewriter, everything. That's the reason why when I go out and talk to university kids, I say, yes, learn all the technical tools that you need, but don't dwell on it, because by God, in about 30 seconds is going to be something brand new. You better learn a skill, a craft of storytelling or whatever, that will be timeless. And if it's delivered on the backs of milk cartons, it won't make any difference because you still have pictures, you still have compelling sound bites, you still have words, and you have graphics. And that's pretty much it, you know, in whatever configuration. So if you can figure out how to do that, you can consistently put out a product that will get you a paycheck. Does that answer it? I'm not sure, but that's my philosophy.
Probably wasn't what I was looking for, but it was splendid anyway.
Oh, thank you so much. Anybody here on the floor have a question? Yeah. Yes, okay.
When you do those human interest stories, I work in current affairs, and I do tend to go and do the interview, the master interview first. Do you do that, or do you start shooting some overlay first to get to know them a bit more?
Yeah, it depends on the subject. Some people who are extremely nervous and think you came to interview them and they don't understand how the rest of television works will be distracted if you don't get around to doing the interview first. Most people, I find, are more comfortable if you spend some time with them as they do what they do and you take pictures of doing what they do, and they just kind of, you know, get comfortable with the crew and with you, so that when you do sit down, you're not a stranger. The other people who are on television consistently all the time are these professional types, you know, who know how to give a 12-second soundbite, and they're great except for the fact they're giving that 12-second soundbite all over town. So it's not the same. You've got to find some way of putting people at ease, and so you just kind of gauge the person as you come into it, and then, you know, be flexible. I think flexible is really the key to the whole thing. Or maybe like in a sports metaphor, you know, if you're lining up and you think you're going to run through this hole, but the hole is gone, you know, you don't just keep going through the hole, you go around the end and you find another way of doing it. And so if you can make that shift along the way, you'll be okay. And so many of us decide this is the story, and then we kind of, you know, lose touch of anybody else is going to be touching our story. And so everybody brings their own kind of view to the story without talking to each other, and pretty soon it looks like a mishmash. And instead, you know, if you can make those little course corrections throughout the day as you're doing your thing, or your 5 minutes, or your hour, or your, and if you're doing a longer piece, for instance, like a documentary, don't start the night before. Don't think about it for 12 hours. You know, get ahead of it and get some elements that you know, you have to know when you're painting oils and when you're painting watercolors, and you get in trouble if you try to do the wrong thing with the wrong amount of time. If you're going to have an hour show, boy, it better look like an hour with spin on it. And these pieces that I've been showing you, and the only reason I'm showing you these kinds of pieces, this is what I do. But that doesn't mean I didn't do the other stuff and can go back tomorrow and do it again. It's just that that's what this is. But if you're going to be given the luxury of a little more time, it doesn't mean that you're going to have longer interviews. It means you're going to spend more time trying to think about how you're going to do it. And I don't spend any more time editing. In fact, sometimes I spend less time editing than people who are doing breaking news, because they're still in the fog of what the story is about. So they edit, they re-edit, and you know, Peter comes in and says, well, that's not working, so you re-edit it again. Well, I'm trying to do all that in my head, and with everybody else we're working with, we're trying to do that before we go in and start spending money, so that when we actually get in to do it, it's like bing, 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 and we're still changing, you know, because when you get in there and you start moving the Ouija around, you say, oh, this goes with that, great. But you can do it efficiently, and as long as you do what you do efficiently, and you come up consistently with a B-, B+ story, you know, you're probably going to make it. I wore you all out. Yeah.
Probably the obvious one, quite a boring one, but out of 35 years of telling stories, is there one that stands out as a favourite after all this time?
The next one. Yeah. And I know that's a flippant answer, but it's absolutely true. I don't know what I'm going to do the day I don't tell a story. I'll probably be just telling stories to my grandson, but who, by the way, will be 1 year old next week, so I'm going home on Friday. But I think I've been blessed because I've been able to fall from story to story with people who are still at bat. You know, they haven't lost their cat down the well, all of them. Some of them have actually discovered something new and different. Like, for instance, one I did just the other day was it had a great subtext. I always try to find, and especially in these longer stories, a secondary story that's going on. In this case, this guy saved an old-growth forest out in Washington when no one else could. He put a rope around one of these big trees, and took a picture of it and sent it back to the insurance company that was going to cut all these trees down and said, just put the rope around your conference table and you're going to see what you're going to lose. And he was able to save this old growth forest. But in the process, he also gave us a great insight, so I put part of this into the story, because he was able to help establish a national park when no one else could. He realized that when Lewis and Clark went through one side of the country to the other back in the early 1800s, that they actually had never seen the West Coast the way all the historians thought it was, because he walked it and he was a nature photographer. So at the time I was doing it, the president was out there, and this guy had not been invited. He spent 12 years getting the national park, and he was not invited. And he didn't care. So I'm thinking, okay, there's a sub-story there that's going to be a real takeaway. And it turned out to be bigger than the story we were doing. This is what he said. He said, I've been watching for years good ideas go down in flames, because good ideas, in order to get done, have to attract money and power, neither of which I have. But I have to approach this as if I were trying to teach my son how to ride a bicycle. If I finally get to the point with this good idea that he wobbles off, I'm not going to run by the side and say, hey, it was me, I taught him how to ride the bike. Because he says money and power has a conceit that they did all the work. You know, they're the ones that want to show up. They live or die by being on Channel 7. They love it. And he says, I don't care. What I want is to get the national park done. So he says, I didn't want to scare them away any more than I wanted to take credit for my son who was wobbling off on his bicycle. So I said, once I got this money and power attracted to it, I stepped into the shadow, and by damn, we got the national park. So I'm thinking all these people who are at the Parent Teachers Association and who've had their ideas shot down for the last year, besides the story which is on the surface that we're telling, they're going to love this guy's insight. Now, he's not running for Congress. He's not going to the moon. But he has gotten a real insight on how to work money and power. And he's just a photographer walking around out in the woods who, A, figured out how to save an old growth forest, B, started a national park, and C, didn't care about getting any credit. In fact, his line was, he says, there's no limit to what we can do if you don't care who gets the credit. Because the people who want the credit live and die by the credit. And that's why they got money and power. I don't have it, but I want the national park. So I'm saying, if I don't put that into my story, I'm really missing the best part of the story, and it really doesn't have anything to do with saving the old growth forest, but it's really fascinating. So I would do that over and over and over again, ask that secondary question to myself, is there more here than meets the eye?
Bob, best pictures first, most memorable last. What's the difference?
Well, you've got to have a picture that's going to grab them. So the question was, best picture first, memorable picture last, and what's the difference? It sometimes can be very, very minute, but I find that most people, in my 40 years of doing this, most people who watch stories on television only remember the first shot and the last, if they're around for the last. So the first shot becomes very important to hook them. So, for instance, if you're doing a flood and some woman is crying and the baby is out in the flood, but it's too far away for you to get a shot of the baby trying to be rescued, and the cameraman is sensitive enough, or you're sensitive enough, to shoot the tear coming down the woman's face. I once wrote a story of 23 seconds on the tear, which also gave us time for the baby to finally come back into the river, and so when you paid off, you say, well, the baby's okay. But the tear was the strongest picture. But the best picture was Mama finally getting the baby. That is the most memorable. But it's only memorable within context of the opening picture, which is this dramatic tear coming down. What's going on here? I didn't tell them everything in the first, I certainly had the aerial of the big flood and all that. And then from the aerial, you just dissolve right into this face, and you put a little bit of mystery in it and let it develop about, here's Gloria, and she's looking for something. And obviously, I don't have to say that it's pretty traumatic, because it is traumatic. It's kind of like with Darryl Hunt. You stop, and he turns to talk to the mother, who still believes he did it, even though science says he didn't. But to have that little dramatic moment. I've done stories like on a 100-year-old baseball player, 100 years old, And he told me, he says, you know, the mayor used to say that if you get a hit and you run and you should walk because you might die going to first base. He says, boy, what a way to go. I hope that happens. And so in my piece, of course, he finally gets the hit, right? And I told the editor, I said, how long does it take him to run to first base without a cut? And he says, oh, it's probably too long. It's like 35 seconds. I said, let's do it. Because the joy of that piece is to see if this guy in real time is going to make it, you know? Especially if you set something up like that. Because I'd made a comment earlier that the guy that was working the scoreboard was so old, you know, he was like, that these guys could ride the bases faster than the scorecard guy could change, you know. So we kept cutting back and forth earlier to set up the joke. But everybody expected us to cut back to the scorecard guy again. But we've already established that joke. That was the best one to get started with. But the memorable one was to see if this old guy was going to die or not. And of course he didn't. He made it to first base and it was like, yay, you know. And so that's what I'm saying. Just because it's journalism doesn't mean you can't use a little theater technique, you know, a little natural sound from, you know, how things work and the music. The thing about music's all over the place now. If you're not careful how you pick music, people will only remember the music. Because they'll say, oh, I remember I was on a date that night when that was real popular. So what I do is I find somebody who is a really good musician, but maybe they scored a movie that never made it. You know, so if it's Quincy Jones, it's still Quincy Jones, but it isn't anything that you ever heard Quincy Jones do. So if you want to establish a song to your piece, at least they're not thinking about the song, they're thinking about the story. It enhances the story. But what I'm saying is, as a writer in television or in radio or movies, you have to think about a whole lot more than just the words. But also that makes it a whole lot more fun. Because everything has to work in harmony, and when it doesn't, it's kind of like, that doesn't work. And everybody, you don't have to be, you know, adept at doing all this, but you have to know enough to ask a good question if you don't know it, and maybe somebody else standing around technically will have an answer, and then to see how it works. You know, watch people as you're editing. But if they're laughing at it in the edit room and suddenly you have to shorten it, you don't throw out the part that they laughed at. You let the joke play, or, you know, the emotion play, and you tighten everything else around it. But I've seen a lot of times where you've had a really, really good spot, and when they need to cut it for time, you cut it in the middle right where you're building, you know, the emotion, and that's not the place. But the reason they don't cut it more effectively is they think, I'm the writer, I don't want to cut my words. But here's another little tip. If you've got a scene that's advancing, but it's going to take a while before it pays off, and you don't want to cut away because you want it to build to either the humor or whatever, you measure the time. Somebody says a piece of natural sound that's important that sets up the joke, and then you've got 5 seconds in the middle, put a line of copy in there. Something that you need to get said, put it there, then shut up and let them hit the, you know, you don't have to stop and let everything stop. At some point you can still keep layering in what you need to do, but you're fitting it in. You're writing it to the, you know, the space you have. And that's a technique that your spot will never get any longer, but you'll still be able to have the emotion and the pacing. When I first started on the Today Show, in order to be able to do these longer pieces, we used to have a minute 10 maximum on every story we did, a minute 10. And so I decided, okay, for a year, I'm going to bring it in at 58 seconds. I'm never going to tell anybody I'm doing it at 58 seconds, but everything I do is going to be 58 seconds. And I did it for a whole year. And everybody else, every other reporter was calling up the desk saying, I need another 30 seconds. Well, you got a minute 10. And I always said, I'll give you back 12 seconds. And finally, after a year, I'd been looking for a story that I thought would kind of hold up at a longer, and I walked into the executive producer and I said, I'd like 2.5. Okay, Bob. Because they knew, by that time they'd seen what I was doing, and they figured if this guy has enough discipline to bring his story in at 58 seconds, if he says he needs 2 minutes and 22 seconds, it's going to be filled with something that I want to put on television. And so slowly I started to establish a reason to do these kinds of stories. If you're working with somebody who is on your team who's burnt out or tired or what have you, and maybe they edit the thing and it didn't work out, and he's going to expect you to come and yell at him. Instead, I would go and re-edit the piece the way I thought it would really work, and then I would go to one of the fringe shows And I'd say, "Can you put this on like on the midnight news on Saturday?" "Sure." Because it's kind of a reprise of the story we did. And then one or two people, not me, one or two people would say, "Hey, that worked pretty well." And I'd say, "Well, go down to Jerry and tell him," the guy that completely bagged it, "that you saw his piece and you loved it." Well, now Jerry deep down knows he didn't do a very good job. So he eventually goes and looks at the story and he sees how it's re-edited. Now, you haven't gone to him and said, "Nah, nah," you know, they just know that, you know, because it got better and people don't differentiate how it got better, that it made them look better. The next time, Jerry is on the game when he's working with you. And we are in the ultimate team. Even if we're out there by ourselves with our little computers and uplink and stuff, we still rise or fall on how well we work together. And the best way I've found over these years to be, you know, have a long and happy life is to try to figure out how to bring people back to where they were when they got the damn job. Because we all get tired and burned out and all that. But if you deflect most of the credit for stuff, and the truth of the matter is you are only as good as the people you're around. It's a cliche, but it's absolutely true. And if you do that, then people elevate their game when they work with you. It happens all the time with me. I mean, part of the reason why these stories work, a good part of it, is because of the other people's contribution, which I'm lucky enough to put my name on. Besides that, I'm not going to show you the stuff that didn't work.
Bob, that was brilliant. I think we've
Oh,
kept you for
no, thank
your
you.
wife for long enough. If anyone's got any final questions, please ask it now, because I think we've had as much wisdom as we can cope with in one night. And did you really do stories in 58 seconds?
I did.
I thought that only happened in Adelaide. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter.
It's been a wonderful experience. I've learned something, and I'm a geriatric, and I'm sure everyone else has too. Thank you very much for coming. Would you please thank Bob Dotson?
Thank you all.
And one more very important thing. This is an operational matter. I believe we have pizza upstairs.
Oh, that's the real reason I came. Thank you all.